this is like 5. This is 9:40.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this seminar on the social contract in times of crisis. We live in turbulent times. Just as countries were recovering from the pandemic, a sharp rise in food and energy prices is taking another toll on households and threatens to push many into poverty. This turbulence in the global economy points to the importance of social contracts. Social contracts, an understanding of mutual expectations that binds citizens and their governments. Through such contracts, citizens pay taxes in exchange for public services and protection against adversity. The COVID-19 pandemic strained social contracts in many ways. It revealed weaknesses in the health, education, and social protection systems. This affected disadvantaged groups the most. Specifically, poor and vulnerable households suffered worse health consequences. Children from poorer households experienced larger educational losses, and low-skilled, informal, female, and young workers were the most likely to lose their jobs. At the same time, the pandemic also provided an opportunity to showcase the value of government support. When appropriate systems are in place, government protection of its citizens can be a lifeline. As documented in our fiscal monitor, many governments were able to protect citizens' livelihoods through swift and innovative response packages. But we are now facing shock after shock after shock. The global economy is vulnerable and fragile. Nearly all over the world, governments are taking actions to protect their citizens from the cost of living crisis. That has already pushed many into hunger and poverty. The climate crisis, the impact of digitalization and automation on low-skilled jobs, and the scars of the pandemic have led disaffection and social protests. These extraordinary times provide an opportunity for government to renew their social contracts. But this will require a decisive response from governments. Let me outline 3 key areas. First, infrastructure. Governments must act now to increase investment in basic public services and resilience in such areas as healthcare, education, physical infrastructure, and social safety nets. These additional investments should be embedded in medium-term fiscal frameworks. Second, trust. To strengthen public trust and support social cohesion, it is essential for governments to deliver and meet the demand for basic public services and more inclusive policies. People could be willing to pay taxes in return for public services, especially during bad times when protection is most valuable. Even where the starting point is low trust in government, reallocating spending to services that citizens value, such as healthcare and education, can help build trust. My third and final point is on transparency. Strengthening accountability in budget formulation and execution through fiscal reporting and auditing can reassure citizens that they get good value for the taxes they pay. The credibility and effectiveness of government with a fair, transparent use of public resources is key. The international community can help through financing, policy advice, or capacity development. More challenges will put the social contract to test. Today's panel will help us consider how to improve the social contracts during these challenging times. They will help us better understand the lessons from the crisis and going forward, how to make societies more resilient to future shocks. I look forward to an engaging discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Managing Director. I'm Stephanie Flanders, Senior Executive Editor for Economics and Government at Bloomberg. I'm delighted to be here because it's obviously one of the most important issues that the IMF deals with, but perhaps not always front and center of our conversations, even the Bloomberg reporting of IMF programs. And we have an excellent panel here and remotely to discuss these issues. I think we particularly want to focus, we're going to talk about the what has happened to social safety nets, what holes have been revealed and exacerbated by the multiple crises the Deputy Managing Director referred to, shock after shock after shock. But I think we really want to focus on the what to do and the when to do it. How can governments move ahead, often as they face these very difficult, still difficult macroeconomic headwinds. So immediately to my left, we have Dr. Situmbeko Musokotwane, who's the Minister of Finance and Planning in Zambia. Sarah Cumbers is next to him, Director of Evidence and Insight at the Lloyd's Register Foundation. Abebe Emro Selassie is Director of the IMF's African Department. And we have remotely, on the left-hand side, the Director General of the ILO, Gilbert Wangbo, and Justin Wolfers, who's Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Lots of people, lots of issues, not very much time, so we will try and be very succinct and concrete in what we say. Sarah, I'm actually going to come to you first because you have done a very interesting survey at the Foundation, which I think provides added texture to what we're talking about. And you've looked at the resiliency of people in the face of shocks in lots of different countries. So just tell us a little bit about the results.
Yes, we have. Thank you, Stephanie. Lloyd's Register Foundation is a global safety charity, and we invest in education, innovation and research programs across the globe. And we've got a long-held interest in resilience, which is why our 2021 World Risk Poll focused on resilience. We commissioned Gallup, the global polling company, to undertake a module of polling questions in 121 countries, 125,000 people across the globe. And the kind of questions that we asked focused on the softer metrics that you can use to measure resilience. So we're all very used to looking at economic security within a country or the state of its infrastructure, but Gallup asked on our behalf to 125,000 people a whole range of questions that give us an indication of what their resilience is like on the ground in their everyday lives. So the kinds of questions we asked were, how long could you survive? How long could you cover your basic needs if you lost all of your income? What's your experience of loss of critical services over the last couple of years? And then we ask about whether you think the government cares about your well-being and whether members of your community, your neighbours, care about your well-being. And these give us a whole range of different metrics by which we can measure resilience. And what the World Risk Poll shows us is that in the areas of least resilience, quite often that coalesces with people's experience of disaster. And so we're finding that communities who've faced natural hazard after natural hazard, shock after shock, are actually the communities that are least prepared to deal with them.
And I recommend people, if you want to, there's a lot in your report, and I think the different dimensions that you look at, people's sense of agency, social capital, other things. We'll get to a little bit more of it later, but it's a very rich source of information. Minister Musaktwani, your government came to power a year ago, and Zambia has been grappling with not just the legacy of COVID, but now serious macroeconomic challenges in the global environment. What are the priorities that you're looking at? How are you thinking about the social challenges that you're facing?
Thank you very much indeed. And among the various challenges that faces the world today, in our case, it was also the challenge of debt and sustainability. And one of the ways we decided to tackle that was to get into an IMF program through the common framework and thereby begin a process of debt renegotiations. So people were very fearful. You are going to an IMF program. Don't you know that with an IMF program, there will be less money to be spent on the social sectors? You are going to make poverty worse. In actual fact, the very opposite has happened because, number one, we had already decided as a government that we are going to reprioritize our spending. As we do the adjustment, reprioritize some of the expenditure so that we spend more on the social sectors to uplift those who are downtrodden. And what better method can you do that other than educating the people? So what has transpired is that in actual fact, as we spent more money on the education, we have provided bursaries for all the children to get up to high school. And the way this was done is no one in the capital city decided who was going to get a bursary. The bursaries were decentralized to the lowest level, in other words, the constituency level. And they were told, here is the money, you choose who is most deserving because you are the ones that live with one another. You know the economic situation of each one of you amongst yourselves. So you choose which person, which child is most deserving. And within the last, I think the last few months, it's amazing just how much school enrollment has gone up. Certain cases, 100%. A clear indication that previously so many children were being left out. And now with these bursaries, they are going to school, the classrooms are overflowing, the children are sitting on the floor because there's not enough desks. But we have an answer for that as well. We also provided more money into these rural communities for them to decide what to spend on. And with the over-enrollment, most of this money is going to construct new classroom spaces. It's being used to purchase desks. It's being used to support the most vulnerable. So I think for us, our experience as we go towards debt sustainability through the common framework, I believe we've done much to support the most vulnerable in our society. Let me leave it for now.
And Abe Selassie, the minister talked about empowerment, giving people choice. I mean, is that part of the challenge when you look across Africa? Is it at least as much about the way you tackle these things as it is exactly what you do? I mean, what do you say to governments that really don't have very much policy space for addressing these issues?
Thanks, Stephanie. I think a very good question. I think the first thing to say is, I mean, there's quite a lot of variation in the priorities at the moment. So it's a little bit difficult to generalize across like such a heterogeneous region. But to the extent we can generalize, I would say where we are seeing quite a lot of pressure is, I mean, first and foremost, the number of people that are food insecure is going through the roof. I mean, tens of millions more people food insecure now, either as a result of region-specific shocks or the big increase we've seen in international food prices. So I think that we see as an urgent need. And I stress this because, we're talking about the social contract, and, really one of the key elements of the social contract for sure for governments has to be, of course, making sure, people are fed as much as sheltered and kept secure. So at this particular moment, I think it seems appropriate to focus on that as we talk about the social contract. And then the second, a little bit more in the macro IMF policy domain, and a cross-cutting one that we see across the region is accelerating inflation. Again, because the most vulnerable households are the ones who have fixed incomes and whose incomes tend to get eroded, and the amount of money they have cannot go as far. Again, that's another important policy area of focus.
And the Director General, I don't know if we've got our remote speakers. I can see them before, now I can't. Shall I just trust that they're there?
Yes, we are.
Aha, okay. The voice of God, as we call it in the broadcasting world. But Director General Wangbo, we talked about insecurity and vulnerabilities. We know in the world of work, the gig economy, the informal labor market has expanded enormously with these shocks, as always happens when the formal sector is squeezed. How do you look at the way the world of work has been affected by these crises, and what challenges that presents for the social contract in countries?
Thank you so much, Chair. Indeed, the multiple crises that you referred to this year are quite worsening already long-standing challenges in labor markets and causing rising inequalities and insecurity as we are witnessing it. We have seen unprecedented losses in working hours, job and labor income, and the rising cost of living this year is placing additional pressure on already quite very strapped and indebted households. Our figures in ILO show that so far in 2022 alone, 8 million workers joined the ranks of the working poor. We talk about people that, although they have a job, they are struggling to pay their monthly bills. And this is taking place in a context in which about 60% of the world's employed population work in the informal economy with little, if any, little social protection and income support. So, and during the pandemic, losses in informal employment were twice that of registered formal employment, showing the extreme vulnerability that these workers have to face. And during the COVID-19 crisis, 4 times as many jobs were lost as during the financial crisis in 2008. And we still have a major deficit in the number of hours worked around the world, which is equivalent in our estimate of 112 million full-time jobs as compared to the pre-crisis. So we're using 2019 as a benchmark. So there has been a huge and lasting expansion in the number of people working from home, which is another dimension. And that figure rose from 8% of the workforce before the crisis to 18% during the crisis. And our preliminary data for 2021 and 2022 indicates that the numbers working from home remain quite very high, higher than the pre-crisis era. So another point that I want to quickly put for our discussion, at every point in the crisis, the effect on women has been disproportionately greater than on men, partly reversing the progress made in gender equality. And what labor market recovery there has been is still not closing the gender gap in hours worked. So we consider here in ILO that we must act not only urgently, but act in a way to restore social justice. So when we talk about the new social contract, it's really to bring about a better social justice. We need to ensure that labor market deliver economic security and equal opportunities, and that working women and men have protection against risk and also assure a just share of the economic progress. Over to you.
Well, you talk about just shares and inequality, and I do want to sort of shift us on to concrete policy priorities, the what and the how. And Justin Wolfers, one of the reasons we feel we intervene and we worry about the impact of these crises is because of the scarring, because of the permanent effects that these, when you fall into poverty or when you have a period of unemployment, you're more likely to then have your income affected through your life. Inequality today breeds inequality tomorrow. Cost of living squeeze now could have very long-term consequences. So what policies do you see when you look at what has been produced by these crises? What are the best interventions for helping children in poor households escape that cycle?
Yeah, I just wanted to offer a moment of rhetorical reframing, because we economists almost always obsess about what's wrong with the world and what could go wrong. And if we're thinking about a social contract, perhaps the way to rebuild optimism and capacity is to talk about what's right in the world and what works. And I think we economists have a tremendous ability to improve the condition, the human condition. And you know, while I worry about the current moment that we're in, it's also true that the ongoing economic growth has done more to improve the human condition and to reduce poverty than anything else. The growth over recent decades delivered hundreds of millions of people from hunger, including through the most of the pre-COVID years. That, you know, extraordinary growth in China has done more to reduce poverty than anything else. That the development of COVID vaccines themselves, an outgrowth of economic growth, were the most extraordinary response to a pandemic ever. And so even though the world is imperfect, and even though we worry about scarring and we worry about inflation and we worry about inequality, we should also acknowledge that almost any economic or social indicator, from maternal death to happiness to GDP, has been getting better. And almost all of them just before COVID were at the highest and best levels ever in human history. And over the past couple of years already, we see that things are repairing. So there's a lot we can do about the world, and there's a lot that we can do to help the world. The one really splendid piece of good news about the COVID recession is it's been an unusually brief recession. The bad news is that it was unusually deep. The good news is it's brief, and so things like scarring, that people spent too long out of the workforce and lost contact with work, are less likely to be a huge issue this time around, particularly if we manage the response well. So I see a lot to be optimistic about. And then, of course, someone reminds me of inflation, as you just did, Stephanie. And I think the important thing to realize here is that inflation is confusing, it's destabilizing, and it feels out of our control. In our economic models, inflation doesn't determine your real income, the real rates of poverty or unemployment rates. And everyone believes that except any member of the general public. And I think that's what makes the current moment so difficult. I think if we come to understand this as inflation is something that can put us on the cusp of a populist moment and can be politically destabilizing, adds urgency to thinking about that set of issues. Although the good news is that it has only historically been destabilizing at times when inflation was unusually high. And for most countries, we're not currently there yet. And so if I want to maintain my optimism, it is that we have to move past the current moment, continue to repair, continue to, with all the good ideas that people have talked about so far. But I'm also going to suggest we're going to bring people along if we do so with a sense of optimism.
And to be fair, I asked you what worked. That was my question. So I think we were.
What works is everything we've done for the last many, many, many decades. Global poverty has never been lower. Average incomes have never been higher. Maternal deaths have never been lower. Happiness has never been higher. There's a lot of things we're getting right.
Sarah, let's retain the optimism a bit. When you look at the survey that you did, it wasn't always the case that the richer countries were more resilient, was it? So where is it that in what ways did you see countries with more limited resources actually punching above their weight when it comes to the social contract?
So we measured four particular areas of resilience. We looked at an individual, at a household, at a community, and at a society level. And you're right that high-income countries, it was a given that we would see strength across many of those domains. But one thing that shone through really, really clearly in the Foundation's World Risk Poll was the high levels of community support in low-income countries. So the question about whether your neighbours care about you, in low-income countries, 35% of people, so over a third of individuals, said that their neighbours care about them a lot. And that fell to 20%, so 1 in 5 in high-income countries. And when you think of first responders in the event of a natural hazard that may lead to a disaster, it's the community who are there first. And that's why this level of community support is so important. But if you look at regions like Central and Western Africa, for example, those high levels of community support were a jewel in an otherwise barren resilience index, where actually the region saw a resilience index that was probably less than 50% of those in other areas. So it's not true that it's not going to save you from running into that disaster, but it's going to go a long way in terms of that first response with members of your community.
Abe Selassie, I mean, how do you think about resilience when you are operating in you go into a country or you're advising a country with very limited resources? What are the interventions that you can do which are going to not just help today but build resilience?
It's a very good question. If I may, I just want to touch on kind of, I think we see it also a little bit in Zambia and other countries. I mean, the points that Justin was making. I think the motto, Kristalina repeats this all the time, is that we always expect the best. We think we have agency, we can make a difference, but we also have to prepare for the worst. Huh? And what worries us and why, I'm very optimistic about the region, but why I worry at the moment is because there's so much that can be avoided. We talked about scarring earlier. We have countries like Uganda where for 2 years schools were closed because they didn't have access to vaccines. They didn't have, a way to protect people. So there is a lot of scarring already in my region, in sub-Saharan Africa. So, and all of that could have been avoided, and more can still be done to facilitate growth. So, forgive me, but before answering your question, I just wanted to say that. Now, in terms of how we advise and how we work with countries at this difficult moment when space is constrained, I think it goes without saying that a bit more emphasis on social protection is called for now. So that unfortunately means less emphasis on growth agenda, less emphasis on perhaps investment. And that's heartbreaking. But I think the moment requires right now a bit more emphasis on strengthening the social contract for the reasons I said, I mentioned earlier. Food insecurity is going up. There's been an increase in poverty in the region. So reversing all of that, I think, is a very important point of priority. And often that comes with a trade-off that, the growth agenda is a second priority.
And Minister Musokotwane, you spoke very eloquently about how you were supporting education and the success that you've had bringing children back to school, which is so important for these reasons. Do you see in your own country, or do you see lessons for different communities having more or less social capital have turned out to be more or less resilient in the face of these shocks? I wondered how this issue informs your thinking.
Yes, I think in the first instance, for most of us in Africa, the resilience comes out of the fact that contrary to the initial thinking or fears that COVID would destroy our populations, people dying on the streets and so forth, because obviously we're the last ones to get the vaccines and so forth. To the contrary, I think this has not happened. We are probably one of the continents that has come out with less damage in terms of the death compared to the other continents that had more resources. So that being the case, the disintegration of society, in that sense, you would say, perhaps has been less savage compared to other parts of the world. Secondly, I would say that the sheer wish or the sheer determination of human beings to survive under tough conditions, that has also helped. We definitely want to do something for ourselves so that we survive this episode. But there's also something that I want to say which gives us hope and optimism for the future. And of course, this varies from country to country. In the case of Zambia, as we talk about resilience and getting into our economies back, we are one of the producers of a mineral that holds the future for the green economy. I think we are number 3 or 4th, I can't remember, in the world, producing copper that everybody knows is key to sustaining the world environment. Well, our challenge then is how can we create conditions that attract the investments to come and dig this type of stuff out. So one of those conditions, of course, is to create a stable macroeconomic environment, deal with the issues of debt, which my friends here in the IMF and others have helped to bring about. So the next thing now with a stable economy is how do we attract investments so that we produce more copper, but not just that. How do we attract investments to make value addition on copper and other minerals that are key for the world being a green economy? That, of course, means that if we do that successfully, the economy will be uplifted. Okay? Our economy will be uplifted. But I also believe that, and I think this is important for first world economies to understand, the days of shipping out raw materials to be processed elsewhere, yes, they hurt us, but also hurts the first world economies. Because if we were to process those commodities in Africa, wealth in Africa would increase, prosperity will increase, which means that we will be able to buy more from the stronger economies. So we act as a locomotive, some kind of a contributor to the locomotive of the world economy to take it out of the COVID crisis. So investors out there, government out there, let's work hard to bring these investments to dig out the copper, value add within us who produce these items, because then we shall contribute to economies coming back to life. We'll buy more computers, we'll buy more phones, we'll buy all sorts of things from you. Thank you.
So that's a call for a global social contract, I think, that we would have some degree of recognizing our mutual mutual reliance on one another, which maybe we're a little bit away from. Director General Huangbo, the labor markets around the world have been hit by these crises, and also the question of solidarity arises. What is your advice to countries that are trying to strengthen their resilience of workers and build some solidarity?
If you will allow me, I would like to challenge a little bit Professor Wolfers, if I can come back quickly to the point that you eloquently made. I think it's important to, first of all, quickly agree that there has been progress, even if you look since the Second World War or since the 70s, a lot of indicators of human development have improved. But at the same time, I'm quite very worried and I'm very careful about the law of the average on that. What we are talking about is how do we use the good, positive economic growth, the advances in gig economy, the technology, use that to fix what is wrong in our current contract, our current social contract. You know, when we talk about, as I'm speaking, 4 billion of people have zero social protection scheme. And when we have this very, very good news in developing vaccine against COVID in a short time period, yet when we that were living in the northern part of the hemisphere were at 70% vaccinated, we talk about 10% vaccination or less in Africa. That's what we're talking about, the problem. Okay, quickly come back to the point that you're making, Madam Chair. You know, in many advanced economies, labor markets are cooling down just because of the tightening of the policies, and we can see from the steep decline in job openings. And this policy tightening in advanced economies is having damaging spillover effect, obviously, on developing countries. So I joined the point that was made by my predecessor taking the floor. At the same time, the risk of a wage price spiral seems to be a bit exaggerated in my view. Recent analysis, both from ILO and IMF, finds that real wages are falling or stagnating. By contrast, we have seen corporate profits increase to historical level. How, therefore, to use that to the good of of all the citizens? This is the challenge we have. What is required is a very careful balancing between macroeconomic policies so as to address high inflation, which is quite critical, while at the same time providing targeted support to the most vulnerable. And we propose, therefore, that in tackling inflation, government try other tools also at the same time, not just the interest rate. For example, intervention in setting prices for social purpose should be considered, rechanneling the excessive or the surplus of the windfall profit in the energy sector to use them for employment and income support instead of that could also help us and be considered as a policy option. Let me stop here.
That's a very helpful contribution. I don't know. Did you want to respond to that, or were you?
No, just to react to the point you made about the global social contract, international social contract. I think that's a very important point. I mean, we think of the social contract as within countries, but particularly an institution like this.
If there is a global social contract, IMF must be in there somewhere.
Well, we're trying. I think we are doing what we can, but I think I want to touch on a broader issue. One of the things that concerns us and why debt issues have become problematic is decline in official development assistance over the years. It has declined from about 4 or 5% of GDP at the turn of the century to about half of that. I'm talking about recipient country GDP. So what countries have had to do, of course, is rely on more expensive borrowing, which has added to the debt burden. So I think, as we urge, from this side of the table on countries to, emphasize the social protection spending, I think it's incumbent also on the international community to not forget, that they need to step forward and provide financing. Just to be clear, I'm very proud of what the IMF has done over the last few years, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. I think we've provided, well north of $50 billion in financing in 2 years, which is, unprecedented in our history. But, I think it's much bigger challenge than just what the IMF can do on its balance sheet, and official development assistance, bilateral from MDBs, also has to go up quite significantly.
And in individual countries, since the social contract is our subject, just sort of moving on, or sort of developing some of the thought that we had. I mean, Professor Wolfers, there was a lot of talk during COVID and a lot of evidence during COVID, actually, of social capital, of people coming together in ways they might not have expected to. Is there any evidence now that the people have changed maybe what they think the social contract should be? They're feeling more solidaristic, they're more willing to have spending on progressive taxes and redistribution?
I think the thing that COVID revealed to all of us in all of our communities, whether it's my son's soccer coach or the university I work in or my country's leadership, is we learned some institutions are working incredibly well and some are working incredibly badly. One of the important things we saw was that those with strong social contracts, with strong bonds of reciprocity, did deal well. My own home country of Australia is an example, which, while our response was imperfect, it was widely understood that your job was to look after your neighbour, or as we'd say, your mate. And that strong social contract helped Australia weather the storm of COVID. I'm now living in the United States, where instead neighbours went to war with each other as the issues became highly politicised. And I think we end up in 2022 with less of an ability to get anything done together. And I think this really points to the importance of a social contract. I want to go back and I want to agree with what the ILO Director General said about the importance of social protections more generally. Social protections themselves are luxury, and governments can offer more of those protections when their coffers are full. So to draw back to an earlier conversation, I don't think the economic growth agenda ever competes with the social protection agenda, but rather the social protection agenda is undergirded by and it's paid for by the economic growth agenda. And so if what we want is effective social protections, we're going to need two legs to support it. One is economic growth to fill the coffers and reduce the need. And the other is a social contract to make it politically sustainable. And then that feeds in yet again, which is the stronger the social contract, the stronger the shared understandings and the ties that bind. That in itself is going to feed into economic growth. It's possible to have growth without shared understandings. It's just a heck of a lot more expensive. And as anyone who's been involved in policy knows, a lot less politically can be done without those shared understandings. So I think the three really go together: growth, a social contract, and social protections.
Sarah, I mean, from your analysis and from your own experience, what does a strong social contract look like?
Well, from personal experience, being based in the UK at the moment, I'm probably not the right person to ask about what a good social contract looks like.
It's a subject of lively debate.
It is a subject of lively debate. But there are, I think, some key principles, regardless of where you live. I think that open and transparent decision-making within government, based on good evidence, being clear when there isn't evidence, is really important. Public engagement and participation in decision-making would be another key principle. But also, again, from recent experience in the UK, conduct in public life and making sure that if you're making decisions on behalf of the citizens of your country, then you behave as you're expecting them to behave. So there are some key principles. But the other point I want to make is that this can be measured. And we've got a question on the World Risk Poll that measures the extent to which people feel that their government care about them. And a shocking 37% of people globally said that their government doesn't care about them at all. And I think that gives you some indication of the crisis at the moment. Now, this was in 2021. I think it's probably got worse in some areas rather than better. And in some regions, so Central and Western Africa, over 50% of the population there said that their government didn't care about them at all. So there's a lot of work to be done. We can measure it. We can ask the same questions in the same countries in a couple of years' time and see whether things have changed. And it'll be really interesting to follow that up.
Minister, how do you think about the social contract in your country? And does it sometimes, what is important to people as part of the perceived part of the social contract, does that sometimes conflict with even what you're being told by the IMF? So, for example, in a lot of countries, energy subsidies are hugely popular. They're felt to be a fundamental right. And yet, they're often the first things that the IMF will say, they're not efficient, it's not a good use of your money. How do you weigh up the things that people value against what might be economically expedient or rational?
Yes, earlier on I spoke about the support that we are giving to children for them to go to school. Obviously, that costs money. It is a good thing. It is something that we should all accept, but it costs money. So the question is, where does the money come from? To empathize with a lot of people, a majority of people in the country. And part of the answer is that we had to look inwards and ask ourselves the question, what are the priorities that we should be focusing on? And indeed, at that moment, or just before that moment, we too had subsidies on fuel. For good reasons, because the price of fuel is skyrocketed. But we needed money, and we had to ask ourselves the question, where is this money needed most? Is it on putting money into the pockets of those of us who own cars so that we can drive, while half of the population are not going to school? And we have to go back to our people, to the society, and says, these are the choices that we have. We can't do both. We have to decide on one. And for us as government, we've decided that the choice is clear. We must put this money away from subsidizing fuel and put it into education so that the children can go to school, so that we can hire more teachers for them. And I think our society has understood that. We made it very clear this is not money being taken away from you so that we can spend it on ourselves, on all sorts of luxuries and other things. This is your money that we are taking from you, but giving it back to you so that your children can go to school, so that you have more teachers, so that they have medical facilities. I believe that people have understood that, and so far we have no problem with that. So I think that is a practical demonstration of how we can empathize with our citizens, those who are weakest, and see how we can support them.
And it goes to what I forgot what I was going to say. But it goes to things that we have been talking about before. Oh yes, transparency. Sarah was talking about the importance of transparency. Making that choice transparent to people is helpful. I was also distracted because I was thinking as you were talking, we have had this advice to many different countries about energy subsidies. Maybe it will be a little bit more difficult, at least for European governments, to give that advice now that they've spent €1 trillion giving energy subsidies to their own people when the prices actually went up. We're just about to run out of time, so I think we're having maybe a last round of very short answers to the question of what one opportunity or one priority each of the panelists would see in this moment when it comes to strengthening a social contract. And I think Director General Wang Bo, I will start with you. I mean, is this a moment, as we thought maybe it would be in the middle of the COVID crisis, for strengthening solidarity and social contract? Do we have an opportunity here? How do you see it?
No, I think this is an opportunity for all of us. On one hand, I like the way one of my colleague panelists put it, to come with what I call the three leg, the economic / technology successes. Secondly, the social. Thirdly, the environmental dimension, which we didn't talk too much about, and making sure that we can move the three leg at the same time. We have a unique opportunity to continue the economic growth, but at the same time, putting measure to make sure that that growth is really used to reduce the inequality. So I really believe, imagine all of us, all the multilateral, the bilateral, the private sector, the civil society, having some kind of a coalition for a new social contract that help us moving in the direction of that new social contract that we are all looking for. We need that coalition to bring the momentum and keep that momentum, and having data to measure the progress we are making.
Justin Wolfers.
I just had my son visit me. I think this is the most extraordinary moment for reinvention of anything that any of us will ever face in our lifetimes. We saw countries do things with their social safety nets that they've never done before. We saw them act with the political system act at rates we've never seen before. And right now we're on the cusp of a complete reorganization of work. This, of course, is the movement toward working from home, much more a white-collar than a blue-collar issue. But what that means is almost everything is back on the table in a way in which at any previous set of IMF meetings, we'd all sit around and say, wouldn't it be great if the political windows were open, and they're wide open right now?
wide open, although potentially economic choices are getting tougher and tougher. But I do like the positivity. Sarah?
My advice would be to be driven by data. Download our report, Lloyd's Register Foundation World Risk Poll. Have a play around with our interactive resilience index. You can explore the data for yourselves. Thank you.
Abe Selassie, do you feel like all the great window is opening? We look up.
No, you know, what inspires me always is kind of the kind of resilience the minister spoke about in our region. I think I remain, every time I'm on the ground, I have to say, I remain extremely optimistic about the region's prospects in the long run, but it is a difficult moment and you know, the region needs both reforms internally, but also the international support to come through it. So, but I remain optimistic about, you know, where Africa will be in the coming years for all the points that Justin noted earlier. I think, you know, the level of human capital, the level of, you know, institutional quality is much, much better than 20, 30 years ago. And from this higher base, I have no doubt we will succeed, but a difficult moment now.
Minister Musa Kitwani, the last word to you.
Yeah, well, solidarity and social cohesion is obviously very important, and we need to do it, but ultimately we should all realize that it costs money to do so. And on the back of that, we should never forget about the agenda of economic growth. The opportunities that arise for us is the green economy that I spoke about earlier on, but secondly also, the realization by the world that we've been depending too much, perhaps on the Central Europe for food, and the need to diversify the sources of food. And for those of us in Africa, we have sufficient space for that food to be produced. We're doing our part to create a conducive environment for that to happen, and we look forward to the rest of the international community in the private sector to come and take advantage of that, produce the food, boost the economy, and everyone will be happy thereafter. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you to all the speakers for a really uplifting session. Thank you.